Folks, this is our last of the 7 letters. Now, it's taken us 16 weeks to go through 7 cities, which is fairly typical of the way we go through this Bible study. We're still, by the way, going through the book of Mark after 2.5, almost 3 years. Obviously, there's a lot in the Bible that we have to digest. We're going to do the city of Smyrna today. That's our final city. Just like Thyatira, they built the city right over the ruins, so you don't get a lot of ruins to go look at. You know, Ephesus, they actually had moved the city, so you have the entire ancient city that archaeologists have put back together. But Smyrna is very much like Thyatira. There's one main area that's an agora, so the statue you see there is just a statue that's in the agora. There's not much to show. A lot of the agora was built in later times, so we won't be looking at a lot of pictures from Smyrna simply because there's just not much to see as far as that goes. As I mentioned, we'll be in Smyrna. This is just one statue in the agora. You can find the agora if you Google Earth and you zoom in, you can see where the agora is. It's a fairly large area, and they've just got tons of old stones stacked up, is basically. So that's something from there. So last week, I'm going to do a quick review of 2 items from last week, because last week we introduced this idea of spiritual growth. Well, not introduced it completely, but we talked about it. And, you know, the topic is, you can go so deep in the area of spiritual growth. And so I thought, well, let's just do a quick review. I'll try to add a couple things to help when we think about spiritual growth. What are we actually talking about? And then some cool things from the Bible that helps explain the idea of obedience. So spiritual growth the default is it always happens in something that we might call the crucible. Now, the crucible just means, you know, it's like you're being forged in the fire. I love those Marine Corps commercials, partly because I was in the Marines, but I love those Marine Corps commercials where they're forging a sword in the fire, because, you know, the way you shape character in the Marine Corps is you send someone to boot camp, and boot camp is no rose garden. It has to be difficult, or else there's no transformation that happens. So transformation always happens in difficulty. So when we hit difficulty, we have to look for the gift. Just like in Deuteronomy, it says, God says through Moses, I will give them honey in the rock. And when you think about it, you think, well, wait a minute, the honey is inside of a rock? I got to go through the rock to get the honey? Yep, that's how God created us. So when we get to those difficulties in life, look for the gift. That was the main idea from last week. The goal of spiritual growth, we shape our spirit to be more and more in tune with God. So it's spiritual attunement. We want to be able to hear God more clearly. And when we can, you begin to hear God in ways that you've never imagined. I know all of you have experienced that in some way, shape, or form, where God shows up and you think, wow, that was just so cool. I never would have seen that coming. So you want to be able to constantly search for ways to attune your spirit. Now, I showed you this kind of diagram, and, you know, models are always flawed because spiritual growth especially is not static. But spiritual growth tends to move in a certain direction, and there's markers along the way that you can just kind of see through listening to people as they've gone through spiritual growth. So, you know, generally we all start somewhere along the line. We don't have an awareness of God. You move from that awareness to a recognition of God, and there's a sense of awe that goes along with that. You then start doing church stuff. It's ritual, it's structure. You begin to put boundaries around your religion to say, how do I learn about God in a structured way? And then eventually we move into this point of serving God, where just going through the motions isn't enough. We want to get to the point where we can start serving God. And all of these are kind of what we see in church in general, right? So you go to a Lutheran church and they have their rituals, and you go to a Baptist church and they have their rituals, and you go to Eastern Orthodox and they have their rituals. And of course, you can also see this is where we disagree with each other because we focus on the externals, but this is where it's generally happening. But I shouldn't say but, there's tremendous growth in that. For anybody who's gone from not being a Christian to a Christian, there's tremendous growth in learning all of that and shaping and understanding all of that ritual and structure and everything about serving God. At some point, though, you move to a point where God becomes a little bit more dynamic. You have to relearn and you let go of some externals. The idea is releasing all things in life to God, and the goal is that you join in union with God. And all of this happens internally. You kind of have two sides to a coin, and what happens between number 4 and 5 is people often bump into number 5 and get a little nervous because it challenges maybe something they learned, at a lower stage. Anyways, the whole point that I talked last week was that we want to strive to be in union with God, at least spiritually, and find peace. The problem is it's a difficult journey. It's marked by suffering. So often we're thrust into a situation in life where we suddenly have to release everything to God because we have nothing left. God, that's the image in the Bible of the desert. God pulls Israel out of Egypt, and he doesn't take them to a nice, comfortable spot. He takes them into the desert where everything in life is stripped away. It all becomes about the struggle. But through the struggle, they learn to rely on God. So spiritual growth, by definition, is a struggle. You have to move through that struggle process, and you look for the gift inside the struggle. Okay, why is it a struggle? This is one of the fundamental questions. Why do we have to retool our way we think about suffering? Well, we've looked at this picture before. You guys have all seen this. We have God and we have man. And of course, there's a huge dividing line between God and man. And one of the biggest differences between God and man is God is unlimited. He has zero limitations. We can't even fathom what zero limitation means. It just doesn't even make sense to us because we have all kinds of limitations. We have limitations in knowledge. We have limitations in our body. We get sick. We suffer. You have limitations on life. So as human beings who are limited, we're always struggling against bumping up against a limitation. And so what we have to learn to do is at the moment you hit that limitation, you then turn it over to God. Human beings are defined by limitations. That's just how God made us. If we were to take away any limitation, then you cease to be a human being. And so it's something we have to accept. So if we did a little logic, and this is what I put on your sheet, is fundamentally being, meaning your being in the world. The fact that we exist in the world is marked by limitation. So being equals limitation. God created all of us, but he created us limited. We struggle against him as the unlimited. Well, limitations is where we find suffering, because the moment you bump up against the limitation, right? So COVID-19 is a great example because it forces us to bump up against the limitation of knowing the future. Like I have a terrible, terrible predictor in my brain, right? I'm always thinking that things are going to turn out different than they are. So I have a terrible predictor, but God knows the future. So when I find myself in a moment of, say, anxiety over COVID-19, that's when I have to turn that over to God and say, God, I can't know the future, but you can. So it's a releasing. I release the future to God. And he says, thank you very much. That's exactly what I do. I'm everywhere. So limitation is where we get suffering. So you could make this kind of a logic statement. If being is limitation and limitation is suffering, then simply the fact that we're in the world is suffering. It's just the reality. And it doesn't mean suffering at the hands of evil. That's not my point. It's just that we all struggle in life. There isn't a human being in the world that doesn't struggle with something. And when we start to lose sight of that and we get angry at humanity itself, that's when people turn on other human beings as if they're the only ones suffering and other people aren't. So one of the great examples of Jesus in his humanity I mean, think about God. God accepted the limitations of becoming a human. This is amazing. What an amazing God that he would come down to earth, willingly accept the limitations that are inherent in being, and then not turn on other human beings, right? So Jesus maintains love, he maintains goodness, he maintains the proper view of God, which then gets him through all kinds of rejection, betrayal, suffering, loss. People, he's constantly trying to tell people about the kingdom of God and they don't believe him and they reject him. It's an amazing picture that he's giving us, is that the path to peace is through the voluntary accepting of limitations, understanding that God is a much bigger place, right? That there's life goes on post this physical world. We'll see that today in Smyrna. And that in the face of human beings and all their frailties, don't turn to evil or don't turn to power, right? Jesus wants to show us forgiveness and love, and that's the path to peace. So it's really a powerful image when we can accept our own limitations, which is very difficult to do. Okay, so that's point one, is suffering is simply part of the journey. What are we trying to do? Why are we struggling then to move upward? Well, we want to hear God. And hearing God is where you can tune your spirit in a way to get closer to God, that you can live then more in peace in the world, because you see the world from God's vantage point rather than our physical vantage point. Now, there's a cool thing. I put this on your sheet last week and then didn't comment on it, and I apologize for that, because that always leaves us hanging with something. What I put on your sheet last week is the idea of hearing, and this comes from the Hebrew, the Old Testament. Hearing God. One of the things it's very strange about the Judaism. So Judaism, our Old Testament, it's a religion with 613 commandments, and yet it doesn't have any one single word that means obedience or to obey. It's a little bizarre that you would think if all he wants is rigid obedience, he would have created a word in Hebrew in his Bible that's specifically for obedience, but he doesn't. So we have the word in English, hear. That Hebrew word is Shema. Deuteronomy 6:4, hear, O Israel. What's the greatest commandment? Jesus says, hear, O Israel. Shema Israel. Well, the word for obey, when you see English in your Old Testament about obey, the word Shema, it's the same word. So obedience comes from the idea of hearing God. When we hear God clearly, then you act. And one of the things we have to really struggle against, because we live in a physical and we're limited, is we often reduce obedience to God to a list of rules, because they're easier for us to identify. Are you following the rules or not? When the idea of obedience is hearing God. So, people often ask the question, how did Abraham and Joseph and all of them, how did God see them as obedient when there was no law given yet? Well, it's because of this, because the word obey comes from hear. So Abraham heard God and walked. Therefore, he's obedient. That's how we would describe it. So my point is this. Hearing God or obedience to God is much more than simply following a list of rules. The rules are important, but they're not everything. And you can see as Jesus is debating with his kin, the Pharisees or the Sadducees or wherever, he's always trying to push them to see beyond simply the rules, where we start judging other people. Because we judge, even in our own physical selves, we judge other people based on rules. Hey, I didn't see you do this. Why do you do that? That doesn't make sense to me. And it's a lot of externals. And God tells us over and over, I judge a man's heart, not the external. So anyways, I just wanted to give you that idea of to hear God is literally to obey. So you want to strive to a point where you recognize God really wants us more hearing. And Jesus is obviously part of the Godhead. He can hear God clearly, but the image of him and his humanity is just like Adam at the beginning, when Adam and Eve walked in the garden and could hear God clearly. So part of our goal is to become Christ-like, like Jesus, and to hear God. So anyways, let me say this. If for some reason, we don't talk a lot about spiritual growth. If you have questions about it, if you want clarification about something, or you want me to help you with a book, or please let me know. Send me an email, or I don't want to leave you hanging if you think, now wait a minute, what did you mean by this? So please let me know if that's something that's calling out to you, like, wait, I want to know more about that. Okay, hopefully that helped. I just want to swing by it a second time. We learn in layers. So every time you swing by and watch a movie the second time, you see something you didn't see the first time. Okay, now this will all come into play with Smyrna, because part of the letter to Smyrna is suffering and don't give up, because there's more to this life. So don't give up in the face of suffering. So let's go back through our map. We want to visually find out where we're at in the world, where Smyrna is. So just as a reminder, the Mediterranean Sea, that eastern end of the Mediterranean is where Israel is. So that's where God planted his house, right on the crossroads of all the world. He didn't put it in Finland where nobody walked by. Nothing against Finland. He put it right at the crossroads of the world. So you had to walk through his land. So Israel, then the good news goes out from there, and oddly enough, incubates in a place called Asia Minor. At that first century, it's a Roman province called Asia Minor. In fact, so much of our New Testament happens in that little circle right there. Now, not all of it, but a lot of it. So as we go closer to this, we notice that's where our 7 cities are. John is at Ephesus. He's pastoring 7 churches. And the letter goes in a clockwise fashion. So he says, write to Ephesus, to Smyrna, that's where we'll be today, to Pergamum, and then he swings around to the rest of the cities. Now, before we go there, let me just a couple points about these 3 cities. Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum are more Greek cities. They were settled by Greeks. When you go inland, you get into different cultures, the Lydians, the Phrygians, whatever. So Pergamum, Smyrna, and Ephesus, very close to the coast, are Greek cities. They're all vying to be the number 1 city. And if you remember when we've talked about this before, Ephesus is like New York City. It was the most powerful. It was where they eventually moved the government to Ephesus. It was where culture was, stock market was. Pergamum was like Washington, D.C. And it wasn't so great with trade, but the government sat there, so that made it important. Now, what about Smyrna then? Who's Smyrna in our metaphor? Well, I would liken Smyrna to Boston. So if New York City is Ephesus, Smyrna is Boston. Boston is always trying to vie with New York City, right? They're constantly competing with each other. Ask anybody, well, if you get in a conversation with anyone from either Boston or New York, it won't be long before they're telling you that. They're very proud of their city, where they're from, and they're in constant competition. It's also a port city, but for whatever reason, New York City became more powerful. So that would be one analogy. So Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and then, of course, the final city, Laodicea. So there's, again, I mentioned not much to see at Smyrna, but let's go closer. One thing we note about Smyrna is that it sits at the closed end of a very long inlet that provides an excellent port. So ships can seek the refuge from the wind out in the Aegean Sea and the waves. So Smyrna was a great port city. Had a natural port where Ephesus was constantly silting in and eventually did silt over. Smyrna, still a port city today. So they outlasted Ephesus in a way. Again, not much to see there, so we'll just go into talking about Smyrna. All right, so this is just some history because the history is going to go right into the letter as John's engaging them with what's happening in the culture and who Jesus is, as just like he's done in all the other cities. So some quick history. They don't know exactly when Smyrna was settled, but sometime around 1000 BC, and it was the Greeks that came over and settled originally Old Smyrna. So it had existed. It's very old. At least you can go back to that original settling of the city. What happened, though, is around 600 BC, the king who lived over in Sardis, which is the Lydian Empire, that king got powerful enough, came west and destroyed Smyrna. And when ancient writers write about it, they write about it as if it ceased to exist. So we could say that Smyrna died. It was dead. It no longer was a city. That's 600 BC. Then, when Alexander the Great, so this is now 330 BC, when Alexander the Great showed up, he has a dream. And in the dream, it says, now this might be all myth as they're telling their rebirth story, but Alexander the Great has a dream, and they say, it says, build a city right here. And so in about 300 BC, the city was rebuilt. It was brought back to life. So you have the idea of a death and a bringing back to life. And now guess what letter is the only letter of the 7 that talks about the resurrection? It's the letter to Smyrna, and we're going to find all kinds of associations with resurrection here at Smyrna. So in the past, they had died in a sense and been brought back to life. At least that's the way they viewed it. Smyrna, they were very proud citizens. Ancient writers write of their vanity about the city. They were very proud of their city. They called themselves, again, they gave themselves the title, first in Asia. First what? Well, was it the first city? Maybe. Are they the most important city? Are they the best looking city? But they call themselves first in Asia. And of course, they're in competition with Ephesus. One of the things, just to note about Ephesus, what made Ephesus so powerful was that Artemis temple. The Artemis temple existed for a long time. And so even when Smyrna was no longer a city, Ephesus was still a city, and that Artemis temple made it very important. Okay, so they called themselves first in Asia. In fact, one of their claim to fame is Homer. The author Homer was born there, or at least that's what they claim. Now, if the greatest author in the history of the known world at that time was born in your city, how long would it take you to be telling your neighbor or your friend from another city about this famous author that was born in your city? Well, it wouldn't take long, because we all love when little details like that about our own city. Okay, so they're very proud. One of the markers of Smyrna is they were very faithful to the Roman Empire, even where other cities weren't. So for instance, one thing that we'll note is that in 195 BC, this is even long before Rome came to power in that area, they built their own temple to the goddess Roma. So we'll see in a minute, they are constantly using their faithfulness to Rome to get stuff from Rome. They would remind Rome. Even the Roman writers talk about how faithful Smyrna was. So they're the first place in Asia to have a temple to the goddess Roma. That temple would have been there 300 years before John got there. About 100 BC, and I say about because this is just something I have to explain real quick, a king rose up in the east. His name Mithridates, which means he was arrived from the god Mithra. Mithridates. We can imagine this. Here's our map. You have all of our cities there, and Rome is moving in from the west, right? So Rome is taking over, and of course, someone's going to fight against Rome. Now, a detail that you probably won't remember, but one of the kings of Pergamum, about 133, so 30 years before this, willed the kingdom of Pergamum to Rome. So overnight, all these cities became Roman or part of the Roman Empire, and there was no war. Anyways, you have Rome coming from the west, and this king from the east, his name is Mithridates. He says, no, we need to resist Rome. Let's fight against Rome. And he's calling out to these cities, if you will come join me, we'll fight against Rome and overthrow the Roman power. And Smyrna said, no, we're going to maintain our faithfulness to Rome. And they did. They maintained their faithfulness. What about Ephesus? Well, Ephesus turned. They went over to the other side. And when they switched over to Mithridates, they slaughtered Roman citizens, even citizens that went inside the temple at Artemis to try to get the sanctuary at the Artemis temple. Even inside there, they ignored the rules and they killed Roman citizens. So you can imagine the awkward conversation later as Rome defeated Mithridates and comes to the people of Ephesus and said, so you betrayed us, yes? Right? Awkward. And what happened was Rome came down very hard on Ephesus. They had years of very heavy taxation. So scholars think maybe part of the reason that we see Ephesus rolling out the red carpet in the first century for Rome is because they recognize, don't betray Rome a second time. So just a thought. Anyways, Smyrna, going back to Smyrna, they were faithful to Rome. And Rome obviously loved that loyalty. So what happened was, in 26 AD, Caesar Augustus is the first Roman emperor as an empire. And Pergamum, which was the seat of the government, said, we'll give you a temple. So in 27 BC, Pergamum built a temple to Augustus. Well, by the time Tiberius comes around, all the cities are vying for that to be the temple keeper. Pergamum wants it. Sardis wants it. Ephesus wants it. Smyrna wants it. Because they all want to be the place that says, we're the seat of where you worship Tiberius. And because of the faithfulness of Smyrna, they ended up receiving the right to put the temple to Tiberius at Smyrna. So there's also an association with emperor worship going on at Smyrna. Okay, next point. It was a very beautiful city. Ancient writers talk about how wide the streets were, how clean the city was. The city is built from the sea up a slope to a mountain where the temples around the mountaintop are described as a crown. So they call themselves the Crown of Asia. Again, that's a title that you can find in ancient writers. A very attractive city, right? San Diego is a very attractive city. And what do we call ourselves? America's finest city, right? So if letter of Revelation was written to us, it would say something like, you call yourself the America's finest city, and then let me point out all the places where you're failing. That would kind of be the way John would, yeah, you might look good on the outside, but let's talk about what's going on internally. Same with La Jolla. La Jolla is called the Jewel. It's a very pretty city. So people they love when your city is attractive. Okay, so Crown of Asia, that will enter the letter. Final point before we get to the text. It all has to do with resurrection. So the first thing we note is the name Smyrna. It's derived from the Greek word for myrrh. Myrrh is associated with resurrection. That goes way back. We'll talk about that in a minute. Goes back to Egypt. So myrrh is a spice that's associated with resurrection. And that's something, of course, that they see in their past, that resurrection, their city had died and resurrected. Now here's where it's going to get a little bit strange. There's a myth, an ancient myth about the phoenix, and we'll talk in more detail about the phoenix towards the end. But ancient writers compare Smyrna to the phoenix. And the phoenix is something that dies and rises again and is associated with myrrh. So there's all kinds of associations with myrrh and resurrection and death and life swirling around this city that we know as Smyrna. And of course, like I mentioned, the only letter that John has that mentions resurrection is to the city of Smyrna. Okay, so at this point, let's open our Bibles and let's go read the letter to see what John's going to say. I'll read straight through the letter. It's very short. And then we'll go text to context. And the text to context piece is on the page 2 of the handout that I gave you. So we'll go through, just read it once, and then talk through each verse and find out where text to context is. So starting at Revelation 2, verses 8 and 9. To the angel of the church in Smyrna write, these are the words of the first and the last, who died and came to life. I know about your suffering and your poverty, but you are rich. I know about the slander of those who say they are Jews but are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Verse 10, do not be afraid of what you are about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. Be faithful even to the point of death, and I will give you the crown of life. Last verse. Like I said, it's a short letter. Whoever has ears, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who's victorious will not be hurt at all by the second death. All right, it's the shortest of all the letters. It's the least engaging with the Old Testament, although I'll show you a couple places where it does engage with the Old Testament. Hopefully, you can hear some of the things that we just talked about that have to do with the context of Smyrna, right? You have resurrection, you have faithfulness, there's something about suffering. So let's go through. We're going to go through verse by verse and then point out how John's connecting text to context. So starting at verse 8, to the angel of the church in Smyrna write, these are the words of the first and the last who died and came to life. Now, context. Think context of city. What are some things that you can immediately see that have just come out of our context, right? So if one of the things we could mention right off the top is they called themselves the first in Asia. That was a title they gave themselves. So you get the use of the first and the last. So are they the first in Asia? Or John is saying, Jesus is the first and the last. So you may call yourself the first, but don't get too arrogant about it. At one point, they had been destroyed and come back to life. So they saw themselves even with the idea of resurrection. Their name means myrrh, which is associated with resurrection. So there you can see the text is bringing that out. And then the final one, and again, we'll talk more in detail about the phoenix later, is there are ancient writers who said of Smyrna, it's just like the phoenix that the city was. It had died and rose again. So all of that is right in here, right? These are the words of the first and the last who died and came to life. Clearly, if you're from Smyrna, you'd be hearing the echoes of your own history. But where's John getting the text? And this is one of the few places in the text where he's actually drawing right from something in the Old Testament. And it comes from Isaiah 44:6, and then I think it's 48:12. You can look at them both, but I'll show you just this one. This is what the Lord says, Israel's King and Redeemer, the Lord Almighty. I am the first and I am the last. Apart from me, there is no God. Now, if you think about what John just did there, right? He applied the words about God to Jesus. And so now you start seeing, well, he's helping you understand the divinity of Jesus. That you can take the same titles and the same words apply to God and apply them to his son. So I am the first and the last. In Greek, if you look at the Greek alphabet, I'm the Alpha and the Omega, first letter, last letter. If you're in Hebrew, I'm the Aleph and the Tav, first letter, last letter. That's another way that John's going to describe Jesus as being the first and the last. So he's pulling directly from a text in the Old Testament that's going to apply that now to Jesus. Okay, verse 9, moving on. I know about your suffering and your poverty, but you are rich. Now, suffering and poverty, scholars think, and a lot of this is debated. Smyrna is one of the toughest ones. So many of these concepts are abstract, and unlike Sardis, where there's huge things that are right there that make it more concrete, scholars have a hard time with Smyrna because we don't always know. What is he talking about suffering and poverty? Is he talking for the church today, which is probably true? Is he talking their past, where you suffered through a long period of time, but in reality you're rich because life goes on beyond this time on earth? I know about slander and those who say they are Jews but are not, but are the synagogue of Satan. Again, there's so many different opinions on this. I'm not going to try to summarize them all because it just gets too confusing but we do know something about Smyrna. The Jews in the city were very aggressive towards the Christians. So we do know that there's something about that. In fact, one of John's disciples named Polycarp was martyred in Smyrna about 40 years after John. So we know that that's true about the city of Smyrna. Okay, verse 10. And this is where we're going to get into the idea of suffering, the afterlife, and faithfulness. So do not be afraid of what you are about to suffer. Think of those words right there. Do not be afraid. How often in the Old Testament does God have to say to his people, do not fear, do not be afraid? It's constant. He says it so many times in so many different ways. And if we take this back to what we started the lesson with this morning, because as humans we're limited, we can't see the whole scope of what God is doing from his perspective. And so our suffering, we become afraid. Fear is something that will just diminish the spirit in an instant. God wants to live in the moment and cast out as much fear as possible so that our spirit can live bright and big and bold. That's how Paul talks about it. So do not be afraid of what you're about to suffer. That command to not be afraid is everywhere. And I think part of it is because all of our limitations and our fear of the unknown in the future becomes so huge. I want to show you one book where you might know this book. So the book is called Proof of Heaven. So this came out, 8 years ago. The guy who wrote it, I don't know if he pronounces his name Eben or Eben. Eben Alexander. He's a neurosurgeon, so he knows everything about the brain. He then contracts meningitis and goes into a coma and is essentially, for all intents and purposes, dead. Then he somehow miraculously comes out of that, and this book is all about his experience. And what I want to point out is what he said when he came out of his coma to his family. So first of all, the family can't even believe that he's awake. And I'm paraphrasing, but he says that he looks around at his family and all he said was, everything's going to be okay. His whole point was, you have nothing to fear. If you read his book, he describes the fact that the love of God is so much bigger than we can even fathom. Yes, there's evil in the world, but it's so small compared to God. But since we're inside of it, we get caught up in the fear. And so his first message was, you don't have anything to be afraid of. And you think, oh, that's beautiful, because that's what God says to us. If you could take my perspective, you would have no fear. And it's very difficult to do, but it's all about that, our growth. And what happens, at the very top of that spiritual growth, the people who can spend the majority of their life at that top thing where it's union with God, is one thing they note is they're not afraid of death. They've cast it out completely. It's remarkable. So anyways, this is just a book. If you're interested in that idea of do not fear, check out this book. It's quite interesting. So do not be afraid. That's just so important for us to, when we meet a limitation, to not be afraid. Okay, well, why not be afraid? Well, he says, I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. Be faithful even to the point of death, and I will give you the crown of life. What are some ideas that are going on in these sentences? So a few that I can pick out is, first of all, don't be afraid, right? Be bold. Take on as much of the perspective from God as you can. Okay, let me not get ahead of myself. 10 days. We're not really sure where John gets this, but the idea of 10 in the Bible is an idea of completion. So he may be using it as numerical, because 10 days, you'd think, okay, well, I can put up with that. He may just be saying it's an idea of completion. You see, there is one reference to Daniel about 10 days, and I put that on your sheet. He wants them to be faithful, right? They were faithful through all of the difficulties where they backed Rome. Now he wants you to be faithful to Christ. And oh, by the way, if you're faithful, Jesus is going to deliver a crown for you. It's not the crown of your city. It's not just because you're a great city. It's you will get the crown of life. Life exists beyond the physical that we see today. So don't be afraid. Be bold. Have faith. Remain faithful, because there's more to this than what's going on in this physical world. Okay, last verse. Whoever has ears, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To the one who's victorious will not be hurt at all by the second death. Now again, you can find there's scholarly debate about this, because you don't find the second death mentioned in the Old Testament. It shows up in some rabbinic writings or the Dead Sea Scrolls. So they think that's where John's drawing from something in that intertestamental period, but there's not real clarity about. But I think the idea, again, he's pointing out that death is not the end of everything. Death is part of the journey. It's a passage to the next stage, what we would call heaven. So, okay, that's the letter. So what are some of the main themes? Well, resurrection. That's all over this letter, and it's all over the idea of Smyrna. Faithfulness. Smyrna was faithful. So John's calling out for you to be faithful to Christ, even in the face of persecution, and to not be afraid. That fear diminishes your spirit. Not be afraid today. Find your peace in God and maintain your faithfulness, because this life is not the end of everything. Last piece. This is what we have to finish with, and this is where, again, things will get a little strange, because probably not something that all of us are familiar with. Something that gets associated with Smyrna, and oh, by the way, will eventually get taken on by our church fathers, is the idea of the phoenix. So the phoenix, it's a mythical bird. I mean, we all know this, at least in some regard. We've all heard of the phoenix. It's a mythical bird. It comes from Egypt or around Arabia, that area. And one thing that I don't know how bright my screen is coming across on your computer. That phoenix that's rising right there, I don't know if you can tell this, it's rising in front of a cross. And I'll show you where they get that idea in a minute. That's that drawing. And at first you might think, whoa, wait a minute. But then let me show you what the church fathers have to say about the phoenix. So it's a mythical bird, obviously a myth. I'm not trying to give credence to anything about a phoenix. It's a mythical bird. The idea is that the bird lives for 500 years. Then, when the bird is about to die, it goes and it builds a nest, and part of that nesting, or some myths say it goes into an egg made of myrrh, and some of it, there's all kinds of the way of thinking about it, but myrrh has to do with it. You have this bird that after 500 years builds a nest, something about myrrh, then a new bird, it dies, and a new bird ascends to heaven. And you get then the next phoenix shows up, and that's every 500 years, apparently, according to the myth. All right, so let me show you, if you read anything about the phoenix and the Bible, you'll find they're going to talk about this verse in Job. So if you want to turn to Job 29:18, there's some issues with the Hebrew word. And when they translated that Hebrew word into Greek, how did they move that translation? So Job 29:18. Now I pulled in this verse that I'll show you is the English Standard Version, and I did that for a reason. So the ESV, the verse starts like this. Then I thought, it actually says, then I said, or I will say, something like that. But you know, if the expression I said to myself is really your thinking. So then I thought, and the verse, then it says, I shall die in my nest. Now, what did we just hear about the phoenix? What does the phoenix do when it's about to die? It builds a nest, and then it dies in the nest, and then a new bird comes out of it. I shall die in my nest. Now, some of your Bibles, because if you're looking at your Bible might say house. I shall die in my house. It's not house, it's nest. They're interpreting how the word would be used, but it's nest. And then it says, I shall multiply my days as sand. Now that's the ESV. So we have two words that we have to look at. Nest, because many of your Bibles say house, and then this word sand. And this is where all the confusion comes in. The word for sand and the word for palm tree in Hebrew sound very similar. It's a vowel sound that makes it different. So there's one vowel sound. And depending on how you sound out the vowel, you're either saying palm tree or sand. Now in Greek, the word for palm tree is phoenix. So palm is phoenix. And maybe the idea of a phoenix, you know, if you look up at a palm tree, it looks like this giant bird spreading its wings or something. I'm staring out my window at a palm tree right now. I don't know if that's where they got it. So anyways, look what I put this on your sheet. The JPS, now JPS is the Jewish Publication Society. Tanakh is the word for the Old Testament in Hebrew. It's like an acronym. It's the Torah, the Nebaim, and the Ketuvim all shoved together, and they call their Old Testament Tanakh. So their version says this, then I said, I shall die with my nest, and I shall multiply my days as the phoenix. Now that's how they interpreted that, partly because in the Greek version of the Old Testament, it's the word phoenix is there. Now, does that mean palm tree, or does that mean... So we don't know. But anyways, I just wanted to show you that very early Christians reading their Old Testament see the word phoenix in Greek. So they start to play with this idea of the myth. And now you could see in this sentence in Job too, if I shall die in my nest doesn't really coincide with sand. But if I shall die in my nest as a phoenix, well, that's now you could say, that fits them, something that they would know from their own culture, a myth that's all over the place. So here's what happens. The phoenix, you find the phoenix in Jewish legends. There's a legend that says that when Eve was picking the fruit from the tree, she decided to share it. Now, we assume she's sharing it with Adam, and she does. But the legend says she shared the fruit with all the animals. All the animals ate of the fruit except the phoenix. And because the phoenix didn't share the fruit, God gave it a long life. Now that's, again, it's legend. They're making it up, but they're using this idea. Roman writers write about it. So Pliny the Elder, who wrote at the time of Jesus, he talks about the phoenix. Now he's clearly talking about it with skepticism, but he does mention it. And then our church fathers. Our church fathers used the idea of the phoenix as proof of the resurrection. Oh, and I should mention too, the rabbis used the phoenix as proof of resurrection. So it even enters our early Christian thinking because it comes from their culture. They're using a cultural piece. So I'll show you one church father who happens to be writing. Clement of Rome writes this letter to Corinth, to the church at Corinth, sometime around 96 AD. That's what scholars date it to. And that's right when John's writing Revelation. So in the letter, he starts going in to explain, give proofs of resurrection. First, he uses plants. Then he's going to say this: let us consider that wonderful sign of resurrection, is what he's talking about, which takes place in eastern lands. That is, in Arabia and the countries round about. There is a certain bird which is called a phoenix. All right? Clearly, his audience is going to understand the myth of what's going on with the phoenix. Then he says this: this is the only one of its kind, because apparently the myth is only one lives at a time. It lives for 500 years, and when the time of its dissolution draws near and it must die, it builds itself a nest of frankincense and myrrh and other spices, into which, when the time is fulfilled, it enters and dies. So where else do we hear frankincense and myrrh? So, one of the things, it's very interesting, it also shows up in John. Jesus is going to the cross. He knows he's going to the cross. And Mary, remember they're out at Bethany? And Mary shows up with a jar of what in John it's called pure nard. Now, the assumption is that it's a fragrance for burial, which is exactly what myrrh was. And she pours it on his feet. And of course, Judas is all bent out of shape because Judas says, hey, that's a lot of money and we could have saved that for something else. Jesus says, no, she saved that for my burial. So he's even identifying this fragrance for the burial. So she doesn't even know what she's doing, but if myrrh is involved, and it probably is, she's anointing him with myrrh, which is a resurrection scent. You also get Nicodemus, the Pharisee Nicodemus, when they go to bury Jesus, he shows up with a mixture of myrrh, and it says 77 pounds of myrrh. 77 pounds. Why do you need that much? It's an outsized amount of myrrh. Well, what's he planning for, right? The myrrh is used in Egypt to take care of the body for the afterlife. So it's like they're involved in Jesus' resurrection without even knowing they're involved in Jesus' resurrection. So the phoenix, it represents resurrection. The early church uses the phoenix to represent Jesus, and this is where I didn't quite understand how they're doing this, but they also represent the Virgin Mary. So the reason I bring this up is because it does apply to Smyrna, and then it's just interesting the metaphors that, of course, our church uses, and this went on for 1,500 years until eventually in our modern age, we started getting rid of the old ideas about Jesus. Now, last piece, because this is what's important. I went to Google, all-knowing Google, and I typed in Phoenix as a representation of Christianity, and bing, so if you go to Google, you'll get it, it'll immediately pop up. You'll find all kinds of links that'll just tell you about this. So this is just some random link. There's no authority to it at all, but the idea, the guy says, did you know that the phoenix used to be used as a Christian symbol of the resurrection? So even Google will tell you that this would be associated. And if it's on Google, it can't be wrong. So that's Smyrna. It's all about the resurrection. It's all about the life that's going to come after death. And part of the message is we need not be afraid, because this world is not the end of the whole story. As much as we look out our window and think how crazy it's gotten, God is we can't even figure out how much bigger he is than what's happening in our world today. That should bring us a sense of peace, even in the midst of all the chaos. Thanks for joining us under the fig tree for today's lesson. If you like this video, be sure to hit the like button below, and make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit that bell to be notified every time I upload a new lesson. You can also check out more teachings here at our YouTube channel or at figtreeteaching.com and enjoy learning about the sweetness of God's Word.